After reviewing all of the facts and evidence of the case, I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
Have you formed any opinions in this case to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I have.
Would you tell us your opinion or opinions?
Sure. In this case, Mr. George Floyd died from a cardiopulmonary arrest. It was caused by low oxygen levels, and those low oxygen levels were induced by the prone restraint and positional asphyxiation that he was subjected to.
What caused the low level of oxygen in the case of Mr. George Floyd?
Well, in his case, it was truly the prone restraint and positional restraints that led to his asphyxiation.
So you considered whether or not Mr. Floyd might have passed away from a primary heart event or a drug overdose. Did you reach an opinion or conclusion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether either of those two causes explain Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell us your opinion?
Sure. After reviewing all of the facts and evidence of the case, I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
What role, if any, do you feel that the fentanyl played in the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
As far as I can tell from reviewing all of the facts of the case, I see no evidence at all to suggest that a fentanyl overdose caused Mr. Floyd's death.
Let's turn to methamphetamine then. What role do you feel that methamphetamine played in Mr. Floyd's cause of death?
I feel it played no substantive role at all.
So Dr. Ritz, then, taking into account all of the evidence that you reviewed, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable. That initial prone restraint positioning that he was subjected to, I mean, that is first and foremost. So if that was not the case, I don't think he would have died. The second, though, was when he was in that subdual and restraint positioning, and he was stating repeatedly that he can't breathe, and he was getting a little weaker in his speech. There was one moment in the video where I heard one of the officers saying, I think he's passing out. That would have been an opportunity to quickly relieve him from that position of not getting enough oxygen, perhaps turn him into a recovery position and allow him to start to expand his lungs again and bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So in addition to not putting him in that position in the first place, when there were signs that he was worsening, repositioning him, I think very likely would have also saved his life. At
the time that Mr. Floyd is determined to have not had a pulse, what is your opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to what Mr. Chauvin may have done that would have potentially saved his life?
Well, just prior to that point, I heard one of the officers actually ask, actually on two occasions, if Mr. Floyd should be turned onto his side. And the response was, no, just leave him. And once the officer announced that he did not have a pulse anymore, I think he actually said he does not have one, was the exact words. At that point, the immediate response would then be to not only relieve him of the restraint, but at that point now you've got to start CPR. You've got to start immediate chest compressions.
Do you have an opinion as to whether George Floyd would have lived if not for Mr. Chauvin's subdual and restraint of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on the ground?
Yes, I believe he would have lived.